it's great to be here. And some of you will think, well, God, Simpson brought us to an environmental group. I did.
Yes.
It's a different environmental group than you're used to. They don't sue. Literally, they don't sue. They work through cooperation with landowners, resource managers, others people, try to find the best solution. And when Chris explained it, what he was really saying was on the non-lead ammunition stuff. He was talking with me about a year ago, and I said, so you guys are supportive of the non-lead lead ban legislation in Congress? And he said, no, we're not. Which kind of surprised me. I said, why not? He said, because we find we get better results going out and talking with groups about the impact, showing them the science and stuff that we have, and they get better results than a federal law being passed. You can learn a lot from the way they operate here, which is what I hope we will do as we're starting to reform, hopefully to reform some of the things we're going to be talking about today. Let me introduce our two panelists today. First one is a very good friend of mine, been a friend for a number of years. I've known him as the mayor of Boise. I've known him as an Idaho State Senator, U.S. Senator. I've known him as the governor of Idaho. I've known him as the Secretary of Interior. I just don't know what the hell to call him. So I see him, sometimes it's secretary, sometimes it's mayor, sometimes it's governor, whatever. But he's been one of the finest governors that Idaho's ever had. So Dirk Kempthorne is legend in environmental preservation of natural resources and other things, and trying to reform the Endangered Species Act and Clean Drinking Water Act and other things is legendary. And he has great insight into what, from all the roles that he's served, in what needs to be done. So Dirk, you want to come up here? Thanks, buddy. You bet. Our other guest is also a former Secretary of Interior. He was the 53rd Secretary of Interior, is that right? 53? Under President Trump, and he was known to have a background in natural resources over the years. You've served in the department in various positions as solicitor and also as the deputy secretary, where he's played a critical role in wildlife and energy and public lands related issues. He prioritized domestic energy production, spearheading efforts to streamline permitting, a subject that we're going to learn about. And in fact, this morning, if you would have listened to the issues that were brought up on the Act panel, almost all of those issues start with permitting. For 26 years, I've been in Congress. Let me finish introducing him. But Secretary Bernhardt was secretary when I was chairman of the Interior Subcommittee the first time. So, Secretary, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you.
These guys probably know more about permitting and what's needed. But I will tell you, it's being talked about. It's being talked about on both sides of the aisle. Right now, I think Manchin and Barrasso have a bill that they're working on and stuff. I talked to our chairman of our resources committee because I had just read an article the day before in the Hill magazine or somewhere that he's going to bring up the endangered species reform, reauthorization, and change, and reforms that are necessary there. And we all recognize that those laws have to be updated and stuff. You can't have a permitting process that takes the length of time that we currently have, requires an industry or whatever to put in gazillions of dollars before they ever know whether they're ever going to get a return on it and stuff. It makes it difficult. So anyway, let's start this discussion. I'm going to start with Secretary Bernhardt. Through your time of Interior, I consistently heard great feedback from my ranchers and other stakeholders in Idaho about the work DOI was doing under the leadership to streamline permitting. You did a great job to ensure permitting processes were efficient, but also scientifically defensible and thorough. Can you describe the key changes you made to streamlining the permitting process, how these changes benefited grazing, mining, and other land management activities. And as the NEPA process became more efficient under your leadership, how do you ensure the agencies are not sacrificing any science, quality, or legal sufficiency? And what does a streamlined NEPA process that is also defensible look like to you? A lot of questions in there, huh? That's a quick question. Yes, no.
So, can you guys hear me okay? A little deaf, I never know for sure. So let me say a couple of things to respond to the question. And the first is probably the most relevant. And that is that I was very lucky when I served as secretary because I had a couple of unique things from my perspective. One, I had a president who was interested in an improved permitting process. He had been, in his private sector experience, he had been a permittee. And so he understood NEPA, he understood the Endangered Species Act, and he wanted improvement. So that was number one. Number two, I had personally had a lot of experience in this space. And I'd seen reforms tried in many areas, particularly during my tenure working for the secretary. Kempthorne. And so I was able to look at some of those ideas and think about how we might really try and do better. And my philosophy at Interior was twofold. Number one, we were working with the law we had, right? So we weren't going to change the law. And so there were two components to all of our efforts. One was, what could we do to make the regulatory paradigm better? So we did some NEPA reform, we did some ESA regulation reform, and we can talk about that. But the other thing we did that I think was perhaps equally important is we changed the processes that the agency used to do their work. And let me give you three quick examples. Number one, I insisted that if an environmental document came to my desk, that it had to be read by a senior executive service member and an attorney, and they had to have signed off on it. And I would read it and cross-examine them on it. And what that did is created a culture of getting back to what the purposes of these acts are. These acts were passed for good reasons, right? And NEPA essentially is think about various alternatives to an issue, and have some public comment about it, and then understand the consequences of your decision. It's purely procedural. And by making the senior folks read their own documentation, what it did is it radically shrunk the scope of the documentation. And my goal was to go to a page limit of about 150 or 300 pages, depending on the complexity, and speed up the process. And that one change led us, for BLM over our period of time, we went from an average of an EIS taking 4.4 years to taking 1.2 years to go from start to finish. Because we set up mechanisms that said, hey, can we get back to the core of, NEPA? The NEPA law itself today is 15 pages. And that's after Congress acted and put in place a lot of ideas that we developed in the Trump administration, frankly, on page limitations and timelines. And so we, on one hand, dealt with the procedural issues within the agency, and then we tried to improve the processes by dealing with difficult definitions and things like that in terms of the regulations. So that was our strategy. And what it taught me is that as long as you have the will to improve the organization, you generally can. We did some other things in terms of defensibility that people might find interesting. I required that the cost of an environmental document be on its cover. Mm-hmm. And you would think like that would be a silly thing to require. But a lot of these documents have gotten very thick because people think it's better to write a thick document to litigate. My theory as a person who's litigated these documents was a tighter document would be better. But I wanted the cost on the cover. So when a judge was challenged about the document, the government would be able to say, look, Your Honor, this cost $50 million or $25 million. So we can redo it, right? I mean, that's the remedy. We can redo it. But would you think about that before you ask us to redo it? Because the perverse problem in our system of governments right now is that there's no incentive for a federal agency to say yes to a single decision. We used to think that the incentive was, productivity. A permit would be approved and that would be good for the world. What's happened now is every single decision is likely to be litigated. And so no one really wants to say yes to anything. And so I think until you create an incentive that's different, and that's really Congress's job, until you create a different incentive, you have to come up with a mechanism of making it easy as possible to get to yes, and then and be in a position to defend the decision you ultimately make. So that's a long-winded answer to a long question.
No, I appreciate that. That's making it incentivize people to do the job is an interesting way to look at it, because I think every one of us here would say the public ought to have a say in how their public lands are managed. But we've created a just lawsuit mill, and somehow that's got to be part of the streamlining. I'll tell you, several years ago, I was meeting with the Idaho Transportation Department here, having breakfast. They had been to a conference in Canada, and in Canada, they were going to build a road that went across a very small corner of one of the national parks. They were all upset that it was going to take 14 months to get that permitted. And our guys were looking at them like, 14 months? We're talking 14 years in the United States, Somehow we've got to change that. But Dirk, I'm going to ask you, before I do, I'm going to tell these guys, he's on the board of the Peregrine Fund. And it used to be, before COVID and stuff, they would always bring out a one of their birds, usually an alpha model falcon or something like that. And they'd come to my office, and staff and other members of Congress and their kids would bring the kids over and take pictures and stuff. And then COVID happened. We kind of got away from it. I was talking to him last year and said, we need to start that up again, because that's really popular and stuff. So last year, brought out an eagle, a bald eagle. And he had it, I love this story, he had it over in the Senate. And then he walked it over to the House, and he walked it through the Capitol. And he gets in the rotunda. And of course, all the tourists that hang out in the rotunda, the redcoats that are showing them the visit and everything. Here's this bald eagle with its wings all spread out. And the redcoats are all saying to their visitors, this doesn't happen every day. But he brought it over. And we need to keep doing that, because I'm trying to make this a well-known place around the country. But anyway, Dirk, as Secretary of Interior, you were criticized for not placing any animals on the endangered species list. In my role in Congress, I've similarly voted and worked hard to limit federal overreach of the Endangered Species Act to ensure the collaborative work being done on the local level to protect and manage species, such as the work they do here. And that's why I put in language to prevent listing of sage-grouse, so that landowners will still work with the state and the federal government to protect the sage-grouse. Can you tell us about your reasoning behind the ESA decisions as Secretary, and what role, if any, should the Endangered Species Act play in areas like permitting? And how can Congress and the Western Caucasus in particular make improvements and reforms to the ESA? And are these areas that require special attention?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. When we walked through the rotunda with all the school kids and everybody there was one group of young kids, and some of the Capitol police officers wanted a picture with the eagle with us. So I handed my phone to one of the young men. I said, would you mind taking a picture, and then we'll reciprocate. Anyway, that night when I got home, went through my pictures, and the young guy had spun the lens around, so I got pictures of he and his group all smiling and giving me, thumbs up. It was great. And when we went to your subcommittee, Mr. Chairman, it was interesting because we had the eagle in a wooden area. Nobody knew what it was at the time. And I watched your committee members walk in with long faces, Republicans, Democrats. when we walked in with this magnificent American icon, the smiles that happened, and every one of your members then got in line with their cameras. They wanted the picture. I think your ranking member came to your office the next day with her grandson.
Yep.
I mean, that's what we can do, folks. If we realize the species that we have, we can cut across some of this partisan stuff. So anyway, thank you for the question about the criticism I've received. I noticed you got praised. The shorter answer is I delegated all of my issues on whether to list or not to my outstanding solicitor at the time. Want to handle that? That's not true. For the record, it's a false statement.
It's exciting.
Absolutely false. I listed one of the global icons, the polar bear. And the White House didn't want me to. I mean, I can give you a backstory on that someday if you want. But we went through this with NASA, U.S. Geological Survey, Fish and Wildlife. I was receiving letters from Russia.
Great lawyers.
What's that?
Great lawyers.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Russia wrote to us. Norway wrote to us. Coca-Cola wrote to us. The Coca-Cola polar bear. When I listed, I never got a doggone letter of thanks or a six-pack from Coke. I now drink Pepsi. But here's the deal. Those groups that were critical, stating I didn't list a species, it's because their view of the world and their sole purpose for existing was to list a species and move on, with no regard to the recovery of the species, which now I think you get a great sense of what happens here at the Peregrine Fund. That's what we're all about, is recovery. And if you look at that Endangered Species Act, it's all about putting a toe tag on a species. I think they should rename the act the Hotel California Act. You can check in, but you can never leave. And that's why in a reform measure that I did, Mike, when I was the United States Senator, was an entire section on recovery. There was also an entire section on the role of states. Why would you not want states like Idaho and what's happening right here on this property to be full partners in bringing about the solution? We were successful. Those of you that know Harry Reid, he's a tough customer. Max Bach, I had their support. We fell short in the House because of a small group of purists, my own Republican purists, that didn't subscribe to Ronald Reagan's approach, which is give me 80% and it's a victory. And I think you've got a comment about that in a moment about how they felt later. But I would be very, very happy to discuss the Endangered Species Act and the reform that is needed, because no one has done any further reform of that since I tried. Good grief. And the idea that all you're going to do is list it? I don't think one of those groups that criticized me saying I hadn't listed sent me a thank you when I delisted the American bald eagle, a great icon of America. So, boy, those who are in business of simply stopping things and putting on the wall, we got this one listed. Man, send them to the Peregrine Fund where we can show them we have recovery. That's who we are. So, anyway.
I appreciate that. It's one of those things where you get a bad reputation, or any of us do that want to make any reforms, is if we don't, it's like I get accused of not caring about preserving the sage-grouse habitat. No, I'm trying to preserve it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do something that actually will preserve it rather than list it, instead of just using it as a way to control land and water. And that's the problem. But what Dirk was talking about was when I first ran for Congress, he was running for governor of Idaho. He was a senator at the time. And we do a bus tour around here. And we go to all the counties and take the Republican candidates, and so it takes you a few days to do it and stuff. But when we're going down through the 2nd District, this is when I was first running for Congress, we'd get on the bus and they had staff on it and everything. And Dirk would always be in the back of the bus on his cell phone. I asked him, "What are you doing on your cell phone?" He says, "Well, I'm calling back to D.C. to the staff because I got this Endangered Species Reform Act, which we got through the Senate, but I'm having trouble getting it through the Republican-controlled Resources Committee in the House." And ultimately, they ended up killing it.
Yeah.
And about 5 years later, one of the people that worked to kill it was Richard Pombo from California and Alan Chenoweth from Idaho and some of the others. About 5 years later, Pombo was chairman of the Resources Committee then. And one day I'm sitting on the floor next to him. And he said, "The biggest mistake we ever made?" I said, "What was that?" He said, "We didn't accept Kempthorne's reform of the Endangered Species Act. We thought it didn't go far enough, and so we objected to it." He said, "But it was a huge step in the right direction." And what we have to realize, and I'm hopeful that if Westerman brings up the Endangered Species Act for reform and reauthorization, that we realize that it's not going to be the bill if I was king for a day would write. It's going to be a compromise. Does it move us in the right direction? Because we didn't get to where we are with all of this permitting problems that we have and other things in one fell swoop. It's been steps along the way. Now we got to reverse those steps that make sense while protecting the species and protecting American citizens' right to have a say in how their public lands are managed. That's the challenge.
Like me, I could not have had a greater partner at my side as solicitor than David Bernhardt during that tough time. And Michael Bogert over there, who was my special counsel as well. But here's what we did. In the Endangered Species Act, there's Section 4D, and we use Section 4D so we could write a special rule because you have the North Slope in the oil and gas industry. They knew what they had to do because of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so we took a special rule and combined it. We threaded the needle, folks. We did not shut down industry, and we protected the bear. Even editorial writers, Los Angeles Times, etc., said, no, Kempthorne is correct. There is no causal relationship between what's happening up north and the lower 48. We had 5 major lawsuits. We won every one of them.
Here. Then,
Give you one more thing.
you
I told you that the White House, they made it very clear for 1 year I was not to list them. They called me over. They'd never let me bring David or Mike. It was just me. And, very clear. John, you remember this.
Yes, sir.
Under no circumstances. So finally, I called up Josh Bolton. I said, Josh, time for a decision. He said, I agree. Can you come over now? I said, yes. I go to the West Wing, go into his office. He shuts the door. Joel Kaplan. He said, Joel, do you mind excusing us? He said, I don't want any witnesses. I said, I agree. I said, Josh, I know the decision you want. You made it painfully clear. But I didn't resign as the governor of a sovereign state to come here and let a bunch of advisors with no real world experience tell me what I'm to rubber stamp. I will not do that. But you have every right to have somebody carry out that order if that's your wish. It just won't be me. He said, hang on, we're not going to have another Saturday Night Massacre. And he said, I have to take the president tonight, and you must prepare yourself to be publicly fired in the morning. That night, dear friends, I slept soundly because I was at peace. I hadn't caved in knowing I'd march to some podium and in front of the national and international media read words that I did not believe. The next morning, direct quote of the president. Did you know this? I am inclined to agree with my advisors, but what is most important to me is the comfort of my secretary. George W. Bush backed me 100%, and we made the right decision. That's what you can do.
It sounds like, and I hope this is, I would like to say I hope this is not the case or whatever, but a lot of these decisions don't depend on whether you're a Republican or Democrat.
Yeah.
They are decisions that we're trying to make to actually recover species, protect those that need it, and so forth. But what if we look at the reform of the Endangered Species Act or NEPA or other things like that? What should be the things that we are focused on as we try to do that this year and next year? Are there specific issues?
Well, obviously, the Secretary Kempthorne talked about the priorities he had in terms of recovery and the role of states in specific statutes. I personally think the conversation with our society has to be who ultimately decides. And what I mean by that is, at the end of the day, our current system is every single thing is litigated. And that's okay if you don't want to get anything done. And the reason that is because I am a lawyer and I like to design how we're going to litigate cases. And I have a group of places that I want to go to bring a case. And so does the environmental community. And so whatever decision David Bernhardt as secretary made was going to end up in one of the most hostile forums in the United States. And that is the process we have. And that comes with a cost.
You're talking judge shopping.
Yeah, but it comes with a cost. And so ultimately, a decision, like we've decided as a society that cost is worth it. And as things take longer and there's uncertainty and we need to, if you look at the increase in electricity costs, the future of electricity needs, given the demand for AI and other things, we need to think about, can we even achieve those things with the current status we have? And if we don't think we can, then I think we need to be more substantive. And so I look at it and say, here's some ideas that are kind of off the wall. Number one, I think we should use more general permits. And what I mean by that is the agency should be told basically, you develop the standards, you make them public, and people, if they comply with the standard, they get an approval. And that would force the agencies to sit down and decide what the rules are and then say that's the rules. The other thing I think we can think more creative about, you brought up the certainty. You take something like the Trans-Canada project. I don't believe there will ever be a project like that built because it takes so long to do. And even if you were to make the investment to try and do it, the litigation risk is so high. So one of the questions I have is like, why isn't there an auction that basically says there's a certain number of permits, just like they do for spectrum licenses. There's a certain number of permits. You have to apply and comply with the rules. We'll set up a tiger team to look at everything. But you're guaranteed to get out of that process without litigation. You would have Elon Musk on one side and Bill Gates on the other bidding for that permit. Okay, because you'd be creating regulatory certainty and you wouldn't have to change a single standard, an environmental standard or any compliance requirement. So I really think that ultimately the system will become challenging enough that we'll decide as a society we need to do something different. And until we do that, my view is that each administration has to look at their role, the rules of the game, and say, how can we maximize them? And that takes individual leadership, building on, I had the chance to build on Secretary Kempthorne's initiatives. And, I'm hoping that if there's another Republican administration at some point in time, they'll look at what I did and think about how to be more creative than that. And that ultimately is what you're going to do within the system. But we have to move beyond it. And it's not really only at the federal level. I mean, if you look at the stacking of regulation and burdens just to get something done at the local planning level, But all of them have worked through and found, hey, we can do generalized permits, we can incentivize things, and we need to find ways to do that at the federal level. So that's a long-winded answer, but if you wanted to raise money, I'd say create an option system.
That's an interesting idea. But I mean, you're right. It is, you got to find a different way to do these things. And it's not just permitting for a mine or permitting for a timber cut. It's permitting to get your permit to graze and stuff, and I mean, those take forever. And you can't believe, as you heard this morning, how much time they spend trying to meet the compliance of the laws and the permits and stuff on their operations.
And on the other side, there's no cost, right? Like if I'm a GS 9 or 11 or 13, the only thing that comes from getting the permit issued is I'm going to get yelled at.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the longer it takes, like that's life. I mean, that's your problem. Well, when you asked what we did, one of the things we had a policy at Interior to just extend anytime somebody asked for more time, we extended the deadline. And I said, we're not going to extend deadlines anymore. And the field went crazy. I just said, we're just not, that's our rule, no extensions. And because it's free to everybody except the permittee. Right? It comes with a cost to them.
Dirk, what would you do with the NEPA or the ESA? Because I need you guys' expertise because apparently we're going to be looking at these very shortly.
Yeah, and I'm glad you are. It's absolutely necessary, and it's way overdue. But Dale Hall, who at the time was our director of Fish and Wildlife Service, I asked Dale, what can we do to streamline this? And what he discussed was one shop, stop, all that stuff. And he told me, and I'll bet this is true today, that his biologists in the field were exhausted from all the biomes. Okay? If you go to Interior and you need approval to do a project, okay, and those of you that have been in the Interior building, you know the hallways. So you go to that building, there's the Bureau of Reclamation, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, and you need to get approval by each of those. But there's no coordination, you see. You're going to spend months with that one hallway. And then finally you think you can move to the other hallway. I mean, this is metaphorically stated, but what happens with federal agencies is they hide the ball. Oh, I'm sorry. I think that went to Forest Service just last month. Well, you go to Forest Service. Oh, no, that we haven't received it yet. You need the coordination, all right? You need the one-stop shopping approach. Also, Peg in the solicitor's office, she was great. She said, let us review all the NEPA applications. And based on that documentation, you could just issue one letter that goes on top of all of it and says, they made the approvals, and you can go forward. One other thing, Mike, that I would add, some of you know this, there are large tracts of land, private land, that somebody wants to sell. And do you know what the billboard says on their land? For sale. No birds, exclamation point.
Yes.
Meaning you're not going to run into the Endangered Species Act because we don't have any birds. Well, what a terrible world that would be. But that's happening, folks. Why don't you then create a process of safe harbor? Just as we pointed out to those nesting boxes that you could put on your land. See, people don't want to do that because the last thing I need is some endangered species to come lay an egg because now I'm under the Endangered Species Act and I lose the use of my land. That's crazy. These farmers, you talk about stewards of the land. Embrace them, make them your partners, and give them safe harbor. I mean, there's so many incentives, which again, I sound like I'm an advocate for the Peregrine Fund. I'll also say that Dale Hall, our former director of Fish and Wildlife, proudly is also now on the Peregrine Fund as his former chief of naval operations, Jay Johnson. One final thing, I had a call from Jim Connaughton. You know Jim? Katie McGinty? Yeah. They're talking about the energy needs, Sydney. And it's what you were saying, David, and that is define what is necessary. If a community, if a region then complies with that, give us certification, and then we can start opening some of these energy facilities. Man, let's get rolling.
Yeah, that's, I've always found it interesting that if I find a rare mineral, gold, on my land, I'm wealthy. And that's a good thing. If I find an endangered species, a rare endangered species, that land's gone.
Yeah.
That's where the old shoot, shovel, and shut up came from, which is not the way to protect species. So that's something that's very important. The other challenge, I think, and I don't know, I've never asked you this, but how much of a problem was it? Or how much better could we coordinate? Department of Interior has BLM, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Reclamation. Department of Agriculture has Forest Service, 2 different departments. And if you look, you will look at the rules from the Forest Service and the BLM are different, and the land is adjacent to each other, and a guy might be leasing land from both of them. And they have different rules that apply to, land right next to each other. Is that an issue?
It is. When Mike Johans was Secretary of Agriculture, I said, give me Forest Service. Let's put it under our umbrella. As Secretary of the Interior, I had more jurisdiction under my authority in Idaho than I did as governor, because we're 2/3 federal in Idaho, okay? Do you want to get into the forest fires and all that?
Sure.
Same thing. When we have forest fires, and this has been a terrible season for us in Idaho. One of the years when I was governor, the amount of timber that went up in flame in Idaho could have constructed 100,000 single-family dwellings. That's the magnitude of this. But the thing is, when that season is finally done, and in many cases, the last fire only goes out when the snows hit it. But then, as chairman of the land board, we have an emergency sale, salvage sale. Let's get that dead timber out of there. It's good for 2 years, folks. It has value. But by getting it out of there, we don't create the environment for the tussock moth and all the other disease that comes to the rotting timber.
Yep.
And again, I offer to the federal government, as governor, if you will just allow me to manage, just give me so many tracts of federal land and I'll make my case in 5 years. But they don't want to do that. Don't be leery of pilot projects. Give it a try.
Yeah.
And all that federal timber land that's gone, that was critical habitat, folks, often for endangered species. And just like with the polar bear, if you lose the habitat, you're going to lose the species. And all it takes, as you know, is just one little simple, somebody files a grievance, and so you can't go forward with a federal timber sale. Carson City, they just opened a brand new sawmill. And Republicans, Democrats, Native Americans all support it because after the big Tahoe fire that they got to get that timber out of there. See, it's really good what they're doing. Kevin Leary, it's really cool.
There's a lot of interesting things that need to be done, but I will tell you what, it's when you say lose the habitat, you lose the species.
Yeah.
The first time I was chairman of the Resources Committee or the Interior Appropriations Committee, the chairman was Doc Hastings from Washington.
Yeah,
good guy.
Yeah,
and I said to him, I am going to strip all funding for endangered species and critical habitat designation out of this bill. Zero funding. Now, we talked about it, and he was all in favor of it, and we both knew that it would get put back in an amendment on the floor, and that's okay. That's what we expected. But we wanted to debate the issue. The Endangered Species Act had not been, at that time, reauthorized for like 35 years or something. It's been like 50 now. We brought it to the floor. People went nuts. They added the amendment, and that was okay, but we got our debate in. 6 months later, in fact, a year later, Doc Hastings, still chairman of the Resources Committee, I said, where is your reform? of the Endangered Species Act. And he said, I just can't get people to agree on it. I said, that's not how you do it. You write the bill you want to write, you bring it to committee and let people offer amendments and stuff. That's how you legislate. Never happened. Now it's 20 years after that or 15 years after that. And unfortunately, I think we're going to do it.
Good.
So, or at least we're going to get the debate going. Let me ask do you have anything else to say before I ask if they have any questions?
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Forward-leaning. Federal agencies should be forward-leaning. Congressman, when you had huge forest fires in California, so I called Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor. Before he became governor, I was his governor. Here, your neighbor, Jameson. Anyway, I said, Governor, I'm watching the Santa Ana winds. They're beginning to really build. And you know, that's 50 to 70 miles an hour. I said, I have pre-deployed rolling stock in your state. You have federal assets now in your state. If you have ignition, we will be there with you to immediately hit it as well. Here's my personal cell phone number. That's what we did. You got to be forward-leaning. At the end of that season, he said, I never had to call that man's cell phone because they were always here. Be forward-leaning and tell your agencies to be forward-leaning.
That's the same with not just that agency and others, but when you look at the disaster relief, the hurricanes and stuff, I mean, they know they're coming.
Yeah.
Get prepared for them, and they try to do the best they can to get the equipment and stuff there. But this is wildfires is going to be a huge issue, and we were very successful this year in making the permanent pay increase for the wildfire fighters. They were actually making like $11.50 an hour, which is, in California, you make twice that much just flipping burgers. And these guys' jobs are dangerous and hard. And the Democrats, it's been a bipartisan issue. The Democrats raised it 2 years ago when they were in the majority and raised the salary. But they didn't authorize it. And Republicans are kind of sticklers on, well, it ought to be authorized before you go do it on appropriations and stuff. So last year, I tried to increase it on a permanent basis, and they went nuts with it not being authorized first. So I said, okay, we'll do it on a 1-year extension. We went ahead and did that to make sure they didn't have a 50% pay cut. And this year I told them, listen, I'm going to authorize it on my bill. You had a year to do it, and you haven't even taken it up. Yeah. So we've got it in our bill to make sure that wildfire pay, and that's going to help with recruitment and retention of these individuals that do this incredible job out there. But we're going to be spending a whole day tomorrow at NIFC talking about wildfires and stuff like that.